afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 8th series, the first episode of the 8th series of Have We Got Planning News for You? I say that twice because I can hardly believe that having started this as long ago as 2020, we are still meeting and producing this show. And it's an absolute joy to see my fellow panellists, at least two of them, at any rate, at the moment, and also Richard, our guest, who we'll come to in a moment. I would like to begin by saying that it's unlikely that we're going to see Charlie because he's in an inquiry. And so I'm afraid you have to put up with me. My name's Mary Cook. I'm a partner at Town Legal, and it is my pleasure to be hosting this evening's show. I'd just like to start by reminding you, our audience, that we started this show in lockdown, and we did so on the basis of trying to raise money for charity. And that is still one of the things that we seek to do. And so we encourage our listeners to donate to either a charity of their choice, or we suggest the Save Me Trust, the National Energy Action Charity, which seems particularly appropriate going into winter given events, and also Shelter, a charity which is near and dear to our hearts. And so I'm going to kick off, if I may, by going, first of all, to our guest and asking him, Richard, to introduce yourself, please, and to tell us where you are speaking to us from, what you are drinking, and what your chosen theme is for this evening's show.
Hello, Mary. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm as you say, I'm the editor of Planning. I'm speaking to you from my home in Reigate in Surrey. I am drinking in line with my theme because of the colour. I'm drinking, I'm never sure how to pronounce this, but Staropramen lager. And my theme is the colour gold, because this year was Planning Magazine's 50th anniversary.
That's great. That's fantastic. I say cheers to that. And I mean, it is not only Planning Magazine's 50th anniversary, we've also just had the 50th Oxford Joint Planning Law Conference. So you're not alone in your 50th anniversaries. And indeed, in next month, I'm going to be celebrating my 35th wedding anniversary. I want you all to realize that I was a child's bride, but this is an anniversary year for me. So, Paul, how are you? Where are you speaking? Where are you speaking to us from? And what are you drinking? And how are you celebrating this theme?
Well, firstly, I'm speaking to you from a hotel in Croydon, where the choice of luxury hotels is legendary. So once again, I find myself in a hotel room. I would be drinking the beer that I brought all the way down from the north. I bought this last week. It's called Vindelander, bought from Twice Brewed while I was halfway across my sponsored walk across Hadrian's Wall last week. The problem is they don't have a thing to open the damn thing in this particular hotel. It's that classy. Obviously, they only open things that you buy from the hotel. And in terms of what I'm doing an inquiry down in Croydon, but immediately hogtailed it straight out of my inquiry once I got the theme to find something gold. And I thought I'd be stumped. But it turns out I'm replete with gold things in Croydon. Golden syrup.
Oh, wow. That's really impressive.
Gold. And some sort of gold wrappy sweetie thing. And best of all, golden curry cubes. I have a pile. So I've excelled myself in terms of golden items. And the poor woman at Sainsbury's thought I'd gone completely balmy when I filled my basket with all that. So thank you, Richard. You really cheered me up.
Paul, that's a great shout. Absolute great shout on the golden theme. And good afternoon to you, Sasha White KC. And I'm going to say something about the KC in a minute. But Sasha, how are you? Where are you?
I don't know. No, I do know. I've just legged it back from my inquiry in Suffolk, and I'm now in Hampstead. So I'm returned to London, and I I'm absolutely furious with Andrew Strauss and the worst review of cricket ever today. How can you not have Test cricket in August? How can that be sensible? But apparently the great and the good think it is. Point one. Point two, it's about to be the 20th anniversary of Landmark Chambers, which was founded early October 2002. So that is a happy anniversary. I'm glad. So I'm happy to join the Joint Planning Law Conference and Planning Magazine in celebrating something this month. And thirdly, I want to say how lovely it is to be back after a significant break for us all. And obviously we were right. Mary, you had the foresight back in July to know that it wouldn't be right to start last week because of certain very, very significant and consequential events.
Yes, well, in fact, let's just talk about that for a moment, because we delayed the start. In fact, initially we delayed the start because we didn't want to clash with Oxford's 50th conference. And then, of course, we had the very momentous, historic and sad loss of our Queen. And from my point of view and the point of view of our audience, I mean, one of the things that there are many things that flow from that, but one of the things that's personal to you, Paul, Sasha, Chris and Charlie, is, of course, you changed from being Queen's Counsel to now King's Counsel. And that must seem a little strange for you, having spent all your life so far being QCs. You now become KCs.
I was going to say, you introduce yourself with a heavy heart now at inquiries when you say KC rather than QC. It feels completely wrong. My difficulty with it is my spell checker, because each time I put my name in the spell checker, it now comes up as Paul Tucker KFC, which perhaps tells you about my eating habits. So I'm sorry about that. Sorry, Sash.
No, I was just going to say it was very strange after doing this for some years to have a decision. I got a decision letter yesterday I'd appeared in since the change, and it's very strange. You take a double take seeing KC after so many years of it being QC. I've got a quiz question actually for our audience, and I don't know the answer. Does anyone know if the late Queen ever attended a planning appeal or inquiry? Was she ever shown one of her visits somewhere, I wonder?
No, but I once found myself at an inquiry where someone spoke, and in fact it was a lady with a very deep voice, and if I closed my eyes I thought it was the Prince of Wales, the then Prince of Wales, now King Charles, and I really struggled to contain myself. It was extraordinarily difficult. Good evening, Chris. Mr. Young, you are most welcome. Where are you joining us from? What are you drinking? And have you been able to make any contribution to the anniversary/golden theme?
Okay, yes, to all of those points. I'm in Guildford, where I'm doing a 3-week inquiry with Hashi Mohammed and Scott Stemp and Charles Streeton, and we're in front of Inspector Gareth Jones, and having a lovely inquiry. I have had my Australian nephew stay with us this week. And so I've got some Bundaberg, but it's only ginger beer because I've still got some cross-examination tomorrow. And as for anything kind of golden, I just took this from the hotel reception. They'll be missing that. It's a golden. It's a golden ornament. I'll put that back later. And then I thought, 50. How can I get? I've been up and down Guildford High Street, and then I remembered, of course, I am 50. So my contribution to celebrating 50 is me.
Thank you very much, Chris.
We should set Richard the test. Could you try and get hold of a copy before the end of the show of the first edition of Planning? And what was the headline?
No, I don't want you to move from your seat, Richard. So you can ignore that. You can ignore that. Now, in the absence of Charlie, can I just say to our listeners that the Sandown Park appeal, which is the dismissed Greenbelt appeal that he was going to deal with, you will find on our website. So you'll be able to get hold of that. And can we, without further ado, Sasha, invite you to deal with the Lambeth Waste called-in inquiry, please?
Absolutely, and I hope Rob might put it up if he's got it. But basically, I'm doing with, here we go. Yeah. This is an interesting appeal for various reasons. It's obviously reasonably hot off the press during our summer recess, and this involves effectively provision of a new building and associated hard and soft landscaping. But look at it, use of the site as a metal recycling and management facility. So it's quite interesting in the current climate, trying to deal with energy and also sustainability, recycling and management facility. Now, as you can see, the inspector recommended the appeal be allowed, and the Secretary of State will notice who made the decision. Minister of State for Housing, Marcus Jones, on behalf of the Secretary of State, made the decision to endorse that decision. So this is dealing with a grant of permission opposed by Lambeth, notwithstanding, Mary's familiar with the myriad of geographical problems in South London, but West Norwood does sit in Lambeth. Lambeth is the council. Now, the important points to take away from this are provision of waste disposal facilities. And I think what's really important is overall, the inspector does conclude that this did accord with the development plan and the additional waste capacity. Lambeth have a capacity deficit in dealing with their waste, probably like almost all London authorities. And in this case, the inspector considered that that was a moderate benefit of the proposal, and also there would be local employment and biodiversity benefits. Against that, there was a concern about the increased traffic through the local streets. And I think one of the most interesting areas of currently of the law is the Equality Act and Section 149 and how that's dealt with. And some local residents advanced the case that there would be harm to certain groups affected by that with protected characteristics by imposing a development of this nature. The inspector basically didn't find that the proposal would naturally and materially worsen the living conditions of those residents with protected characteristics. So for those of you involved in the public sector equality duty, this is yet another case which deals with that really interesting subject in the context of planning. So overall, quite an interesting, very interesting decision. And I think, and I'm going to flag up, I think in the light of what's happened in the past 3 months with energy, this is a proposal that will continue. This kind of proposal will only get greater in the planning system over the next 2 to 3 years as people seek to make us self-sufficient in energy.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Paul, over to you. You're going to talk about the Stopford appeal.
I am indeed. This is a decision by Inspector Woodwards on the last day of August, who allowed consent for 181 dwellings, including an integrated care village, which was C2, and extensive parkland. The inquiry had taken place in May and June of this year, and somebody called Christopher Young KC acted for the appellant successfully, Alex Greaves for the local authority. Interesting in terms of numbers of witnesses, this was a substantial inquiry in terms of numbers of witnesses. I think Chris called 13 witnesses, or certainly 13 witnesses are listed on the appearances. The authority called 4, so 17 witnesses with a plethora of issues. Although there was only 2 main issues cited by the inspector. That was the 5-year housing land supply issue and the effects on the character and appearance of the area, including landscape, albeit it wasn't a designated landscape or a valued landscape. Character and appearance issues always tend to be site-specific, but I think the takeaway from this was the inspector was very clearly impressed by the extensive mitigation that was provided by the nature of this particular scheme, notwithstanding what the inspector described as substantial built form on previously undeveloped land, and particularly drew attention to woodland within a key woodland gap between 2 villages and concluded no coalescence. There's also an extensive section in this appeal decision in relation to need in a number of different respects. First of all, affordable housing need. There was 9 in excess of the 30% policy requirement. And the inspector said that the inspector only gave it only moderate positive weight, which frankly is rather odd given the evidence that was put forward and looking at the findings in relation to affordable housing. The common approach is for most authorities with a deficit to attribute substantial weight. I find it quite difficult to understand why that's the case. The C2 assessment of need was also quite interesting because in that one, the inspector treats it almost like a 5-year housing land supply approach and assesses the requirement, assesses the pipeline, and then assesses the deficit and identifies there's an immediate need to meet that deficit and therefore concludes significant positive weight in respect of it. And then also gives moderate positive weight to the 18 self-build plots. Going back to the affordable housing, it's a bit odd to give the same weight to affordable housing in the context of extensive need as you do to self-build plots, but that's maybe a different pattern for another day. The other takeaway in relation to this appeal is the fact that on the 5-year land supply debate, which is clearly hard fought, the conclusion of the inspector was it was 4.97 years supply. And the inspector addresses the fact that it comes in just below the 5 years and says, yes, that weighs in relation to what weight you give to the market housing that's provided, but is forthright to say you don't just then pretend that it's 5-year land supply. The presumption is engaged, and this is an authority failing to meet the minimum requirements of government. And it seems that those three elements together outweigh the impacts on the character and appearance. It is a classically balanced decision of the sort that we used to get shortly after the NPPF in 2012, but there's been a period where we've seen fewer and fewer of them. So hard fought, interesting case, but it really does demonstrate why leading evidence on need bears fruit. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you very much, Paul. And Chris, you're going to take us to Welwyn Garden City.
I am. And thank you for that, Paul. Well done to Russell Gray and the team there. They did a very good job on what, as you say, was finely balanced because the plan had recently been adopted. So the inspector had to be brave. He had to grant planning permission despite a recently adopted plan. Right. Well, I continue the theme of being the publicity agent for various junior barristers in other chambers. So this is a Zach Simon's appeal. And Zach has been back to Welwyn, where he likes to roll around in the green belt. But on this occasion, he was promoting nearly 300 residential units on a brownfield site. It was an appeal by the HG Group against Welwyn Hatfield. That's an interesting authority, isn't it, in terms of the local plan? But that's for an entire episode, that is. And we've got a proposal which was allowed by Michael Boniface, the inspector. Now, if we go forward to have a look at some of the other paragraphs, main issue was design, character and appearance. As you can see, it was a large commercial industrial building that had been vacant for some time, and there was no dispute that it was suitable for residential development. And of course, Welwyn Hatfield, it was going to be a draft allocation. The site was proposed for 250 dwellings in the emerging local plan in an area known as the Shredded Wheat Quarter. More of that later. And an early 2008 council adopted document setting out a vision and a master plan. So you wouldn't have thought it could really go to appeal, would you? It's allocated for about the same number of houses on a brownfield site. But, you know, Welwyn Hatfield, thank you for keeping the planning bar going. It's terrific. If we move forward and look at the inspector's compliment here, I think Zach's clients could be rather pleased with this. The appellant's evidence carefully and convincingly sets out the design and following its arriving at the scheme subject to this appeal, and assesses the effect on the townscape. The height of the proposed buildings is comparable to those under construction in Broadwater Road West. So a very careful and convincing analysis of design. And this was justified because some of the development was 9 stories high. So it's not as easy as it looks, this appeal. There was a need to justify the scale of the development. If we just go forward in the paragraphs again, we get to what I think is the most fascinating bit, which is the reference to the shredded wheat factory, which is grade 2 listed. Who'd have thought a cereal production company would be responsible for listed buildings? The former has been converted into residential use, and so it was the relationship with that and obviously a sensitivity around that. We just go forward again. And what the inspector says, the heritage assets do not stand alone in splendid isolation. They now stand close to large urban centres and views of buildings. Remember, we covered the appeal in respect of Hampton Court Palace. The inspector saying there, just because you can see it doesn't mean there's harm. And also, it's not the traditional landscape that some of these buildings might have been associated with, although I don't think there is a long historic history of 19th century shredded wheat factories. And what the inspector said was that it was perfectly acceptable in terms of its heritage context. If we just go forward again, this is also very interesting. Welland, of course, is a garden city. We hear lots about that. And clearly a lot of local people gave evidence about this. He says the garden city principles upon which Welland was founded are set out in the Town and Country Planning Association referenced during the appeal. Important principles have guided the inception and successful development of the city. And in paragraph 50, local people spoke passionately about Welland Garden City, and it was clear to me that there is a great desire to protect it and maintain the principles upon which it was built. Wouldn't that be great if we built some new garden settlements and people could feel similarly a great desire to protect them? We just need to move on, politicians. But he said, you have to remember the city has got to grow and meet its modern needs. So he was perfectly prepared to accept this development. And if we just move forward, then we can see the appearances. Well done to Zach and Isabella. Well done. A good, successful outcome.
Thank you very much. I'm just about to start my interview, but I just couldn't help commenting. We've had an anonymous attendee. We do love this anonymous attendee. We always speculate as to who it might be. Far be it for me to tell you what our ideas are, but I absolutely love the idea of calling us now KCs in the Sunshine Band, which is the suggestion there. And thank you very much, Phil Bell, for your kind comments about my 35th wedding anniversary. Right, now then, Richard, you are the first journalist that we have had on the show. And I think this is notable. I also think it's extraordinarily timely, bearing in mind we are poised with our new Prime Minister, having had a long summer of campaigning. And so it seems like a particularly good moment to have a journalist on the show. And so welcome. I'd just like to just introduce you to our readers. You became, as I understand, the editor of Planning Magazine in 1997. And I'm interested to understand what your background was and how you got into journalism and in particular, the job at Planning. And should I be calling it Planning or Planning Magazine, or is the word magazine now considered defunct?
No, we still use that. We still use that term, although increasingly what we do is online.
Online.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's fantastic to be here. My background was I did a history degree at Lancaster University. My first real job was at a sort of a very dusty corner of Reuters, not being a foreign correspondent, I'm afraid to say, but summarizing other people's news stories about things going on in construction. I then had a series of jobs in various business to business and consumer magazines, including I was on a magazine called Turf Management for 5 years, and was then there was something about turf management that persuaded the company that I worked for, which also owned Planning Magazine and still owns Planning Magazine, to offer me the job on planning.
And turf management is nothing to do, is it, with betting?
Pray not. It is to do with grass.
Okay. And I understand that actually, from our previous discussion, I understand that it sounded to me anyway as if you had a great time going off to visit various cricket pitches, golf courses, and you must have had some rather good site visits during that job.
It was for somebody who likes sport. It was great. You could there was sort of no there were endless options for
yes.
visiting great sporting venues. Admittedly when no sport was going on, but it was it was good.
So tell us a little bit more about planning. How many readers do you have? And how has your publication and readership changed over the years?
So we have around 6,500 paying subscribers, and that breaks down. And I think it probably has always been very similar in terms of how it breaks down. It's 40% public sector, 40% consultants, 10% developers, 10% lawyers, very broadly. And I mean, in terms of how it's changed over the years, it's the big change when I joined in 1997. We were a weekly magazine with no online presence. Obviously, that's changed hugely, and we've gone and the website was launched in the early 2000s. I should say that there was 10 years when I wasn't on the magazine. I was on a sort of sister magazine called Regeneration and Renewal that some of the audience I hope will remember. It was, we've gradually moved into more and more frequent online publication with daily bulletins, a podcast now.
You keep everybody informed in terms of headlines, don't you?
Well, that's the idea. What we want to do is keep people informed of what's happening and what it might mean for them professionally. Absolutely.
And you are in the business of obviously disseminating planning news. So I wanted to start by asking you some questions about what you expect our new Prime Minister to do with planning, because I think our audience will be most interested in this. She's obviously made some comments during the electioneering, which were very widely published in our world. But she's also made it very clear that economic growth, is absolutely central, dead center, it seems to me, in terms of her agenda. So what are you expecting Liz Truss to do? In particular, is she going to remove that 300,000 target? But what do you expect her to do, Richard? What are all the signals you're picking up?
Well, I mean, we've probably read and heard similar things, but I mean, very broadly, the broad thrust seems to be that she wants to find ways of pursuing growth, and she is talking a good game about pursuing growth by loosening planning and environmental controls in some places, but she seems very keen with an eye to an election, potentially, in the next couple of years. She seems very keen to do it in a way where this happens only in places where councils want it or where there's local support. And obviously, there's been a lot of talk in the papers this morning about her plan for investment zones, which we might want to talk about later if we're thinking about other people in the government who have also got an interest in this, because obviously it's going to be the centrepiece of the mini budget on Friday. But it all seems to be about trying to achieve some kind of economic stimulus, but get rid of the things that that have a heavy political cost, such as the housing targets, which, as we all know, she's described as Stalinist. It's not right necessarily to describe them as housing targets, but the standard method of assessing housing need. She's telling MPs that she's going to make it harder for planning inspectors to override local authorities. When we talk to people about that, we're a bit baffled as to what that means, because it seems to be saying that we're going to make it harder for planning inspectors to enforce government national planning policy. But I think people have suggested that this might be, again, something that is a fairly sort of minor adjustment of the way planning inspectors deal with soundness tests and local plan examinations. She says she wants to build up more in cities. She said that she wants to change the rules to make it harder to use high value agricultural land for solar farms. I think one thing to take out of it is that she's made a lot of reassuring noises to Tory MPs or Tory members who are concerned about development, but there have been some interesting elements to some of her messages. I think it's quite interesting the way she's talked about new communities and suggested that her investment zones might allow the creation of new versions of Saltaire or Bourneville, which is I just thought that was quite interesting for a Tory Prime Minister to cite a kind of new town that might be different to what is immediately in her members' or MPs' minds when they think about new communities. And she's also talked about the fact that she's behind the incremental expansion of villages. So it's an interesting mix of, pro-growth policies and but mixed with some policies which at the moment seem essential to enabling growth, like the housing targets.
Seems to me it's growth on the one hand, but very tempered on the other. Not a very difficult moment in time, it seems to me, for the industry, because we're on our, I think now, 10th are we Secretary of State or something like that. We've had so many Secretaries of State. Anyway, let me just ask you about Simon Clarke, our new Secretary of State, and what you think he is going to do and what signals he has sent out.
Again, I mean, it's a very again, there are sort of mixed signals from him as well. As has been widely reported, he's got quite a recent history of being an advocate of relaxing Greenbelt in order to deliver 1.5 million homes for younger people around transport nodes. So he's clearly somebody who's got a very recent history of making the case for some kind of relaxation of the planning system, but he's being tasked with by Liz Truss by make it less easy for PINs to override local authorities, and it's and he said that and he's been equally critical of the standard method as it now is. So presumably he's going to make some changes to that. But he is somebody who talks about, in quotes, the absolute need for the country to build more homes. And what he's talking about, he's talking about achieving this through incentives. And I guess I think that that comes back to this other question of whether this is workable. This idea that you can you get the house building that's needed by offering incentives. That seems to raise all sorts of questions about whether the house building goes in the places where people want it politically, locally, and not in the places where there's the most pressing need. Although, to be fair to Clarke, he does talk about putting development, that it needs to go not only where it's wanted, but where it's needed. So it is, as you say, a real mix of signals.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. And what are you expecting from the new Chancellor tomorrow? I mean, you've already mentioned the zones.
Yeah, well, I think that is the that's the big thing that's going to appear in the budget tomorrow, as we understand it. There's been a real consensus about the reporting of what's coming. So clearly, a lot of people have had the same briefing and talking about these investment zones where there would be. And I'd be very interested actually to what people around this table think is whether this is actually legally achievable for the government, but creating looser environmental protections in these zones to encourage development, including around environmental assessment, habitats protection, nutrient neutrality, and recreation mitigation zones. So, all the reporting is that these zones will relax rules around those sort of things in order to encourage investment. Also, some talk about affordable housing requirements being scaled back in those zones. And the incentive part, I think, is the idea that maybe there can be, and maybe this is something that Kwasi Kwarteng will offer, a single pot of government funding. That one of the incentives for local authorities or groups of local authorities to come forward for this will be the offer of a sort of loosening up of some of the restrictions on different pots of government money.
All very interesting, and I think probably good for consultants, good for lawyers, because clients in an uncertain world need advice. But ultimately, in terms of delivery, in between now and the next general election, I fancy it's not going to be great. But I mustn't be too pessimistic. I'm not a pessimistic person by nature. Bearing in mind, Richard, your experience, you've witnessed successive different governments. When you've started, we were in the land of Labour governments, and we had a succession of Labour governments. You then saw a coalition government, and now you've seen a number of Tory prime ministers. And I just wondered what reflections you have on how life has changed since 1997, both in the way policy is made, and also the advent of localism. What are your reflections, bearing in mind your experience and your interaction with governments?
I think the thing that I remember very much from sort of coming to the sector as a newcomer and to covering a sort of this sort of field in 1997 was how methodical the development of policy seemed in those days. So I remember, as a lot of people will remember, the Urban Task Force report coming out, and then that was consulted on, and then that was sort of refined to produce an urban white paper, and then policy changes sort of evolved from that, and it was a very deliberate, consultative approach. The argument against it, of course, was it took a long time, and Labour were quite a long way through their first term of office before they actually started to implement policies, because they'd taken a long time to consult on them. But certainly, I think my very broad feeling would be that in the last 25 years, there's been a less deliberate sort of process of consultation in developing government policy. And I think also, when you think about something like the Urban Task Force, which had about 100 people on it, very much assembled from people who'd worked on the ground in regeneration and local government and planning and so on and so forth, and compare it with, what drives policy making now. And obviously, now the think tanks are incredibly influential in terms of developing planning policy. And you think about the influence in the last 10 years that think tanks like Policy Exchange, for good or for bad, or create have had. But there is now, the extent to which the professional bodies, I mean, I'm sure the professional bodies are still playing an influential role and doing their level best to influence policy, and I'm sure they still have many successes. But you sort of feel that the influence of the think tanks has just risen and risen and risen, and think tank ideas get translated into policy, remarkably quickly. Yeah.
And so we have another layer, as it were, added on. Localism?
Well, I think that the thing you sort of notice about that, and it seems to have become so marked recently, is just the since the sort of concept was advanced, it's been a very difficult genie to put back in the bottle, in the sense that there are fewer and fewer politicians, it seems, who are willing to say, yes, of course, local people's feelings about development are critical, but they have to be balanced with national need some of the time. And that's an obvious argument that you would expect to be raised when, for instance, an MP asks the Prime Minister a question about what the planning inspectorate is, why the planning inspectorate is overruling a local authority's stance on something, but very rarely is, and therefore I think there's a whole lot of people who don't take a very deep interest in planning who just haven't really heard that argument, that there needs to be a balance between local and national priorities.
And do governments brief you in the same way that they used to?
No. I mean, that is something that's definitely changed, and I think that might well be because because they're not as dependent on the professional press to communicate what they're doing and why they're doing it. But I mean, very definitely, back in the 1990s, early 2000s, when a new bit of government policy was released, you would be called in for a press conference, along with national newspapers. You get a briefing from, you quite often get a briefing from the Minister or the Secretary of State. And I think the other thing was that there was a real appetite amongst the department to explain what they were doing to journalists. So if you rang up and said, "Sorry, we don't understand," what the rationale is for, I can't remember what,
X.
Correct, yeah. Exactly. You would actually, a press officer would kind of, off the record or on background, say, "Well, this is our understanding of it. This is why it's being done." They might even put you in touch very occasionally with a civil servant to sort of explain the detail. And that kind of, again, I think there may be a pragmatic view in government that, that they don't. I'm not sure why, but that kind of attempt to sort of win hearts and minds doesn't seem to be prioritised.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, I'm going to open this up now. Chris, what's your question?
Thank you very much, Mary. Fascinating, Richard, your perspective on the changes in government approaches and speaking to journalists and so on. But what I would say is, my question is, planning was intended to help build what the country needed in 1947 after the war. Where is it now? What's your view about where the planning system is now?
I mean, I think my view would be that it was designed to, I mean, very broadly, it's designed to, build what's needed within a sort of democratically controlled framework, and obviously it's designed to be plan led. In recent years, it has been designed to be plan led, and we clearly have a real crisis on our hands on that front in terms of planning authorities. We've been reporting recently that more than 20 in the last 12 months have announced that they're delaying their plans. Presumably many more are actually going slow while they wait to see what sort of stance government is going to take on things. So we have a real crisis in terms of the forward planning part of the system. I think the system is being adjusted by successive governments to be more and more of a development management framework, which which sets national rules for development, and maybe more relaxed national rules than local authorities would themselves allow. But obviously there's a reason for that. I think we still always have to balance the sort of more pessimistic view of planning. We still have to remember, I was mocked once by the Reverend Richard Coles at the Planning Awards for one of our categories, which was Planning Permission of the Year, which he thought was a highly comical category. But actually, a planning permission is a remarkable thing. Often it's a private development proposal that has won basically the blessing of the democratic system, and we still it is still remarkable the amount of there's not enough development approved every year, but there's a hell of a lot of development approved every year through this democratic system. So that needs to be recognised and understood, and valued. But yeah, we have a crisis in terms of forward planning.
Thank you very much, Chris. Paul.
Hello, Richard. The question I actually want to ask you is, what on earth can I do with a thing of Nescafe Gold chocolate, some golden syrup, and a packet of golden curry cubes on a evening in Croydon? But the question I will ask you, you can email me later about it. The question I will ask you is this, and it arises partly from what you were saying about neighbourhood planning and the raising of expectations. And I'm asking you as a communicator, it seems to me that there is a disconnect between what we as planners and lawyers think, in other words, we need a regional planning system, we need a means by which to have strategic planning, and but the public seem to have told this notion of localism has been the panacea to planning. So we've got the disconnect between the professionals saying regionalism and the public thinking localism. So how, as a communicator, do we bring the two together?
I think it's very hard. I think we need political leaders who are prepared to make the case for development. I think it does. We have a planning system which is very frequently blamed for on the one hand halting development, or on the other hand not being sensitive enough to local wishes. It is actually a very powerful tool that if those who hold the levers wish to use, can be made to enable development in I think is in a broadly sort of just sort of process. But we need local and national politicians who are prepared to use those levers and make some of those kinds of decisions.
Couldn't agree more.
Sid, do you know any that might fit that bill?
Well, we're looking for some, actually, and we would very much welcome suggestions. We'd very much welcome suggestions because, I think, to be fair, what we need is some examples, and politicians need to see examples of other politicians who've championed housing need in places where there is a lot of housing need and not suffered for it, because we know a lot of politicians who have suffered for it. So we need to get some good examples, and we're looking for that now. We're working on an article like that now, and suggestions would be very welcome, and not suggestions of people who did it in the 90s or 2000s or in Manchester, 15 years ago, but who are in office now and thriving, while doing it.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sasha, your question, please.
Yes, thank you, Richard. I'm tempted to ask you. I'm not more than tempted. I might ask you, who do you think the best Secretary of State has been in your time and who's been the worst, but you might feel constrained. If you're willing to answer that, do. But can I ask you, let's look to the future. What's going to be, what do you see with your very significant experience? What are going to be the big issues over the next 2 to 3 years in planning, in your judgment?
Well, firstly, on the Secretary of State question, I don't think I can answer who was the best, but I can sort of remember one or two, where I've been, who have been impressive. I mean, I think actually Greg Clark, I think was an impressive Secretary of State. I think the things that happened to the creation of the NPPF was an achievement. I know there are elements of it that like the duty to cooperate, which were always criticised and have proved to be ineffective. But and I know the loss of regional planning was a big loss. Although I'd argue that I'm not sure how effective it was at the time, and it was a focus for political opposition. But I'm quite impressed by Greg Clark. Gavin Barwell was a pleasure to interview because he was so open and forthright and courteous. But those aren't necessarily the only qualities that are required of a Secretary of State. In terms of so I'm gabbling because the much harder question you asked me second about what's coming up, and I mean I think that the big issue is the big issues are, can we get momentum behind the local plan making system again? Can we create a situation where it's not seen as so politically disadvantageous to sort of put your cards on the table in a local plan that you just rather not do it, and there seems to be no penalty for not doing it. So I think that's a major issue. I think obviously planning for infrastructure is a huge issue, and there is an opportunity now because of I think a renewed sort of keen awareness in society of the need for energy security. There is, this is another area where I think government hasn't acted in the past, because where are the votes in building power stations, et cetera, or allowing wind farms? But now that balance may have changed in terms of what public opinion is, and there is an opportunity now for government to drive that forward, and they've got an incentive to do it as an economic stimulus. So that might be a big area.
Excellent, Richard. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts at this very opportune moment in terms of the new Tory government. Really interesting. Thank you very much. And listeners, don't forget Richard's plea. If you've got examples where politicians are thriving, having promoted growth, it would be great to get those across to Richard so that he can include those in his planning article. And I would just like to say now it's time to end this show. Thank you very much for your participation and your comments in the questions and answers. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and our guest then will be Melanie Leach from the British Property Federation. Thank you very much and goodbye.